Welcome everyone to our January meetup. Thanks for joining us virtually once again. Hopefully you've been staying dry, or if you're here in the Bay Area, things have been pretty wet, but sometimes it makes for fun adventures out there. Super excited to have Paul Taylor join us. If you've read through the email bios or Eventbrite bios, then you know a little bit about him, and obviously we want to learn a lot more about him. But Paul is pastor at PBC, Peninsula Bible Church, and he also has started a great platform called AllThingsNew.tech, which really dives into the intersection of theology and technology. And so some great content there through blogs and podcasts, and I think really a burgeoning resource for a lot of us, not just here in the Bay Area, but even beyond, for thought leadership around things that I think we want to know more about, that we want to hear more about, that we want to talk more about. So glad to have Paul here. And Paul, if you want to just do a bit of a deeper dive into your background and history and some of the thoughts you'd like to share.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, I'm really happy to be here. I think, let's see, I met James Kelly 2 or 3 years ago, whenever I think he was starting up FaithTech, and he was out here in the Bay Area, and we had coffee when you could do things like that. And that was fun, and we've kind of been friends. AllThingsNew.tech and FaithTech have been friends for several years now and done a few things together. So it's fun to be with all of you, and thanks to Jan and John for inviting me. And I'll kind of, what I'm thinking of doing is sharing a little bit of my story. And then a lot of what I've done is think about kind of a theological framework for thinking about technology. And so I'll share just a little bit of that. I'm a pastor, so I have no problem talking at great length about theology. So I'll try to limit myself a little bit there. And then try to get a little bit of application in there, but then also try to set you guys up for some discussion to kind of apply practically some of the ideas that I'm going to try to flesh out theologically. That's kind of, you live in the world of technology much more so than I do. And so I'm really interested in hearing how some of the kind of theological connections that I've come up with might connect practically with some of the work that you all do and some of the issues you face. So I thought I'd just start off by kind of introducing myself. This is me and my family. I was telling some folks earlier, I've got 5 teenage kids. We have 3 biological kids and 2 adopted kids. This is my wife on the bottom right. Her name is Rachel. And then my 5 kids, Silas, Ava, Eliana, Nathaniel, and Diamond. A little of my background. I grew up in Connecticut, moved to Texas when I was in high school. My family still lives in Houston. And then I came out to Palo Alto to go to Stanford in '94. At Stanford, I was an industrial engineer and a religious studies minor. So at Stanford, they always made distinctions between the techies and the fuzzies. So I was kind of a little bit of both, more a techie than a fuzzy though, when I was in college. And in terms of faith, I grew up in the church. Really, kind of my faith came alive in high school in a high school youth group that kind of everything clicked for me, and experienced a godly community and godly leadership, and that kind of just was where my faith became my own. So at Stanford, I was involved with a lot of Christian fellowship groups, and it was in high school that I felt called to go into ministry full time. And so I kind of had this plan to become a pastor, but then I went to a prep school in Houston and kind of had my eyes on a competitive university like Stanford. And so for some reason, I got it in my head that if I went to a school like that, I should work first before going into ministry, just kind of get a feel for the, kind of real world. And then whenever I would run that by people, my mentors and stuff, everybody's like, oh, that's a great idea. That's really smart. That'll give you great perspective. So I did that, graduated Stanford and worked for Oracle for 7 years after college. Started out, I had basically worked in product management the whole time. I started off just before our group released a 1.0 product of a warehouse management system, which is kind of a back-end system that helps you manage inventory in a warehouse and move stuff around and put it away when you receive it and pick it up when you need to ship it out, stuff like that. So we were just building a 1.0 system. And it was great because I got it on the ground floor, and then the team tripled in the first couple years. And then after 3 years of full-time work, I decided I wanted to go to seminary and eventually transition into ministry. But Oracle let me keep my job and work half-time from home. And so I moved to Dallas and went to seminary in Dallas and worked from home for Oracle for 4 years while I was attending seminary. So I could live on half of a Silicon Valley salary in Dallas, Texas. Bought a house for $160,000, and that was great. So that's where we started having our kids as well. And so those are some good years. And then when I graduated, left Oracle and came to work here at PBC, Peninsula Bible Church in Palo Alto. This was actually the church that I attended when I was in college. So it was really cool. I've been pretty much a part of this church since about 1995. A lot of years attending, and then now 14, 15 years as a pastor. I did a little bit of college ministry and young adult ministry, and now I'm one of a couple teaching pastors. And kind of, we have a non-senior pastor model here. We have kind of a very flat horizontal leadership structure. So we have no lead pastor, but I'm one of a couple pastors that kind of provide overall leadership and vision for the church. So that's a little bit just my story, my background. So I've always been kind of a technophile, always been interested in technology. And it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago that I decided that we have this lecture series that we do at our church called Theology Roundtables, where we just pick a relevant topic and kind of dive in and jump in. And because of where we are as a church, I always say that if we host a prayer meeting, we get about 10 people. And if we host a lecture, we get about 100. So that's kind of, we live in one of the pastors talks about the IQ per pew at our church. And so we're a church that likes to think and likes to think well. And so we do these series, and I thought, hey, we should do a topic on the theology of technology. So I signed up to lead this roundtable on the theology of technology, and then realized that I don't even know if there is a theology of technology. I don't know what one might be. And so then I had to educate myself and started to read some books and do some thinking, and realized that there wasn't much of an accessible theology of technology out there. There's a handful of books. There's a little more on the scholarly academic side, but not very much that's kind of accessible from a layman's perspective. And so did what I could to lead this seminar, and people really appreciated it and said, hey, we need more of this. This is the kind of thinking we need. And felt like being a church in Palo Alto in the middle of the Silicon Valley, if anybody can do this, we're an intellectual church that likes to think, and so we ought to be thinking about these kinds of topics. So that led me to do a teaching series on the topic. And then from that led me to form a blog, the AllThingsNew.tech, and I started blogging about it. And then everybody said, nobody reads anymore. You need a podcast if you're going to do anything. So then I started a podcast, and that's actually been kind of more fun to me to sit down with technologists and bounce ideas off of each other. So kind of somebody coming from a theology perspective and somebody coming from a technology perspective, and just have a conversation. So that's been really fun to do. And I'll mention a couple of those in a few minutes. Moving into a little bit of thinking about a theology of technology. I find it helpful at first to define technology, because that's, you got to start with knowing what you're talking about. So I take a pretty broad definition of technology. And the way I define it when I'm thinking about it is this. Technology is something we create which extends our natural capabilities. So just a few aspects of that definition. It doesn't exist already. So this is something that humans create. We come up with this. It's something out of our creativity. And then it takes capabilities that we already have, but it extends them. So, a classic example might be a hammer, right? Like you could pound a nail with your fist, but it doesn't feel very good. And so you create a hammer that takes your capabilities and it focuses it in better ways. A few things to note about this definition. This isn't actually only limited to material things or physical things. So things like language is a technology. Things like government is a technology. Things like educational systems or even economic systems are all technologies. When I first started writing about this, one of my editors accused me. He came up with an acronym of, what was it? EAAT, everything as a technology. And he said, like, your definition applies to everything, everywhere, and it's too broad. But I find it helpful because I think it's helpful to think about, even biblically, some of the technologies that were created by people in the Bible, and then compare some of those to some of the technologies that we create. And so one of the first technologies is language in Genesis 2. Clothing is a technology. There's some interesting aspects to that because people create a primitive clothing, and then God actually upgrades their technology. And he upgrades their technology to something that's more effective, but also more expensive because it costs the death of animals when he gives them animal skins. So there's a lot of interesting things there, but that's not exactly where we're going. So in thinking about a theology of technology, I went back to Genesis. And the first thing I did when I started thinking about this was I taught through the Bible in a men's group that I lead. And I just said, I'm going to start with Genesis 1:1, and I'm going to stop every time I see something that makes me think of technology and teach on it. And in the back of my mind, I thought, the Tower of Babel, and I thought the cross is actually a piece of technology. It's a execution technology. So I had a few things in mind that I thought I would get to. But it turns out that I spent about 6 months in Genesis 1 to 3. And by then, the people in my study said, can we change topics now? So that's about as far as I got. But it was really, really interesting. That's a good question. Are the things that create new capabilities for us? Let's get to that in a minute. I like that. And so what I did was spend a lot of time in the creation story, thinking about technology. And the more I processed that, the more it made sense to me, because I have this theory that I haven't actually done, but I have this theory that if you walked around downtown Palo Alto or really anywhere, and if you stop somebody on the street and ask them, do you worry, or do you ever worry that technology is threatening our humanity? If you ever ask somebody that question, do you ever have that concern? Then most people would say yes. Most people would say, yeah, I'm, at some level, I'm concerned that technology is taking something away from what it means to be human. So you'd find broad agreement on that, even among, non-religious people. It's not a religious thing. It's not a Christian thing. But then if you ask all those people, well, what does it mean to be human? Then you would get either kind of I don't know, or you get a wide variety of opinions. And so what I've become convicted of is that the core issue for technology in terms of from a Christian perspective, is what it means to be human and how technology affects that. And I think that's the issue in our world. And I think that's actually a really compelling question for people. And the problem then is that nobody knows what it means to be human, or nobody agrees on what it means to be human. And then that's where I believe that us as Christians have an opportunity to step in, because I think that Christians have an incredibly beautiful, compelling vision of humanity that isn't always what people first think of when they think of Christians. I think that our vision of humanity doesn't have to do with marriage, who you marry, or who you vote for, or some of the like hot button issues that people associate with Christianity. I think it has to do with integrity and truth and sacrifice and love and connection and all these kinds of things, that if you put those things together, then you start asking the question, well, if this is what it means to be human, how does technology affect that? So what that means then, so let me then present kind of a rough outline of some thoughts based on the creation story about what it means to be human as a way of informing the kinds of technology that we might create. So I start off then with a passage that you may be familiar with, Genesis 1:27-28. This is the first creation, one of the accounts of creation. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So God created us in his image to serve over creation, and he created us as a them. He created us as a community. So I draw this little diagram that's pretty simple, but I end up using it a lot, where you have God, obviously, who's at the top, and God creates humans here. He creates us as a them, so there's two of us, and he puts us over creation. And so God creates the creation, but he puts us in this kind of intermediary role. And it's a role that's filled in some ways with tension, because if we're looking downward, we exist in a leadership role. We are meant to rule over creation. But then as we look upward, we are meant to serve God. So at the same time, we exist as rulers. We ought to rule and we ought to submit. And so it's kind of like this. We live in this tension of these two poles, where we submit to God but rule over the earth. And if you're looking at us in relation to the creation, we are as God to his creation. We are to serve kind of in God's stead as his image. And a lot of theologians think that the idea of being an image of God is more one of function than of identity, that we serve as a role, that being the image of God is a role we play. So this is the place we live in. And what that means then is that out of this model, I think we can identify several core relationships that we live with, and this is what I think defines our humanity. So let me go forward then. So I've identified four, and you could probably be more granular or less granular, or you could think of it, slice it in some different ways. But I've identified kind of four relationships then that are primary. The first is that we are under God, and so we exist under some authority. Then we exist over creation, so we exist under some authority, but we also have authority, and so this is that kind of tense role. We exist in community, so we have a with relationship. And then this is the one that's a little tricky to characterize, but we have, and maybe it's particularly modern, but we have some type of relationship with ourselves. We exist unto ourselves. You might think of this as like an inward relationship, or we are centered as people, or we are healthy, or there's some kind of solo relationship that I have with myself that represents my personal health. And so if you think about these four relationships as we have this under, over, with, unto, and that creates these categories that we relate to, that we relate as, and then that really defines our experience as humans. We exist unto ourselves, we exist with each other, we exist under God, and we exist over creation. And then the question I would have, if that's just a really bare bones biblical anthropology, a biblical vision of what it means to be human, then the question is, what does it mean? How does our technology affect that anthropology? And in particular, then, the question that I would start to ask is, how does our technology either help us to live within those relationships or corrupt those relationships in some way? And the cool thing I think about this, or at least that I think, is that this is a very Christian, a very biblical view of humanity. It's straight from the pages of Genesis, but I think it's compelling on a larger scale. The one aspect of it that you might have trouble if you're not religious is the under God. But even then, I think the idea that we exist as humans with some type of limitation or some type of humility or some type of, that we ought to have awe as part of our nature, that we ought to kind of recognize that we are small in some sense. I think that's maybe got some validity even outside of a theistic perspective, though certainly the others are maybe more compelling. But then the question starts to be, how do we live within those kinds of relationships? So I've got a few ideas of application to suggest to you, but maybe we can take a pause here, and I'd love to hear just clarifying questions, or does this make sense? Does this not resonate? Does this seem totally unrelated to the work you do day to day? I'd love to hear some feedback.
I love it. I think about this stuff all the time, and this is very clear. I love that you use visuals to explain this, because it's just a picture is a million words right here. And I really understand this, and this really helps me think about, in terms of whatever I'm building myself, like how to go about doing that and where I fit into that in terms of my own purpose. And I really like the question you posed in terms of like, what's the purpose of technology? That being like, does it further the image in which we were created, or does it detract from it, is the way I think about it.
Yeah.
And I really like that. There's like this zero to go back to all the time. And that really helps simplify a lot of things, because I guess without that structure, I mean, you could easily go in all different directions about, like, should we be defining our own path going forward, or are we using the Bible and interpreting it to strictly, not taking context? I mean, there are a lot of ways you can confuse oneself.
Yeah.
And I just really like how this simplifies across everything. And it's very helpful to me, I have to say. And the question I had was about your original definition. So you define technology as an extension, as something that extends what we naturally are capable of. And I guess my question is like, what about things that don't do that? What about things that either that don't do that? So what an example would be something that either gives us the ability to do something that we're not naturally capable of, or detracts from what we're naturally capable of, which would, I kind of would know your answer to that latter one already. But yeah, so I'm wondering like, what about for things that do like that give us the ability that we don't naturally have to do things we can't naturally do? What are there examples in the world of that? What might they be called?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on like, what it makes me think is how granular do you define capabilities, right? So you might say like, well, apart from technology, we can't fly. So flying gives us new capabilities. But then you could say, well, we can travel apart from technology, and now we can travel, so maybe a little bit of semantics, like how do you define a new, like, I think I would say that we theologically, we don't create, you know, maybe some of you have heard the term ex nihilo, like God creates out of nothing. God is the only like absolute creator. But all of our creation, all of our creativity is derivative in some sense. And so in some sense, we don't ever create anything new. That's maybe from a theological perspective. Certainly like depending on how you slice it, well, yeah, we couldn't fly before and now we can fly. Or we couldn't, you know, access the internet from our phones and now we can. So, but, you know, if you think a little more higher level, like our abilities to communicate, to travel, to store knowledge, to, you know, those things, we don't fundamentally create new capabilities. We're just iterating on better ones.
I feel like you just quoted, "There's nothing new under the sun."
Yeah, someone wise once said that, didn't they?
I'm going to lend some commentary. I learned about FaithTech through one of my coworkers. She's worked 20 years with Moody Radio, Christian radio, and her digital marketers worked with FaithTech. So I have a parallel that is similar to what you're sharing in your testimony of working for Oracle. So I've worked in the secular world in radio and digital marketing. And now I am with Christian Healthcare Ministries, which is a health cost sharing, the original health cost sharing ministry. And when I came on, I did not know technologically that there were some gaps. So coming from the secular industry into the ministry, I realized the gap in which I would express as the world is going 100 miles per hour technologically. And the ministry is, I'm their first SEO manager.
Huh. Wow.
And they've been in ministry for 40 years. So I'm learning a lot, but at the same time, I'm seeing these parallels that the Lord obviously wants me to see in a discerning way of how in so many ways the Christian world has not capitalized and utilized technology the way that they should, especially in a world that is using it in many ways. You know, if we want to go spiritual, in witchcraft, going 100 miles per hour, utilizing in a witchcraft culture. So I have this grief in a way of saying, like, how can I push them forward and get them in a space and place that's going, 100 miles per hour for the Lord. But my initial interest in being a part of this is one of the videos that you had on your website where you shared an example of setting up your home with voice activation and saying, let there be light. And there was a moment that clicked in your head. And even as you share and talk, I'm beginning to formulate, you know, that we are God's technology.
Yeah,
on this earth. He trains my fingers to war and my hands to fight. I am a battle axe in the hand of the Lord on this earth. We speak the word, and you even sharing the example of, you know, we rule and have dominion on earth, but we are here to serve. So all of that resonates with me. This is my first time coming on one of these, but I was very excited to, you know, come across this and also glean in a way of, you know, I haven't gone to seminary or anything like that, but I would say that I'm definitely considering going back to school so that I could be the best that I could be with my previous experience, as well as bringing a new and fresh outlook and perspective and discernment in technology to ministry.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, what you're sharing, maybe I'm going to address some of the questions in the chat, but there's if you go back to my little chart, I actually have about 6 or 7 versions of this chart, depending on different different things in technology. And I think maybe John, it was you that asked, what's the purpose of a tech company within this framework? And I think the tech company, basically what technology does here then is technology mostly increases this relationship. And it mostly technology helps us to rule over creation better, in stronger ways. And in the past, I've done some things where you look at historically what technology has done, and it's made us more and more like God. But there's also, one of the dynamics we face is that it's actually really hard to rule over this creation. And so one of the things that technology allows us to do is create our own images, right, that rule over our own creations. And so you think about social media and
Our
avatars.
reflection
Yeah.
of what God did in us.
Yeah, and so we become God over an alternate creation, and we create our own images to manage that creation. And that, and so I guess one of the questions was what's the cost? What are you most concerned that we're compromising in our faith as we take on the role of a creator? And I think of all of these relationships, the one that's that either is most threatened or is most least aware that we're threatening it is this under relationship. And I think that's the great cost, because I mean, I live in Silicon Valley. I'm a technophile. I love technology. And I think one of the things that, technologists tend to be incredibly optimistic about the capabilities of technology. We think that technology can solve problems, and it can. But I think we tend to be, I think if we have kind of a trap we fall into, it's that we're overly optimistic that technology can solve problems. And then when our technology creates problems, we think that technology can solve the problems that our other technology created. And so we tend to come up with technological solutions to solve problems that our technology created. And I think this under relationship is the one that we're most prone to forgetting. And it's the one that the world's not going to talk about very much. They'll talk about how we're destroying creation, or how we're creating all these mental health problems for ourselves, or we're creating echo chambers and our relationships are falling apart. So they'll talk about those other dynamics, and there's a little bit of self-correction in those dynamics, but it's the under relationship that I think is the most threatened. And that, as Christians, I think helps us to exist within God's framework. And it's not that we're in danger of displacing God. I mean, God is God. We're not going to accidentally supplant him. That's what we're in danger of is false promises to each other and to ourselves. That we're promising things to our customers that we can't deliver. We're promising things to our culture that we can't deliver, because technology can't solve the problem of sin. Technology can't actually solve the problems of the world. And so we're creating false optimism. We're being false prophets in a sense. Let me go. I think we're a couple minutes. We're supposed to break up into groups. So let me do a few just thoughts on application that hopefully will set up some conversation for you to have in your breakout groups. Let's see. Okay. So first is a couple of, oops, that's not what I wanted to say. Okay, first, I thought I'd highlight two people that I've talked to in my podcast that I think show a little bit about how technology can reinforce these relationships rather than degrade them. They're both in the Bay Area. One is a man named Andrew LaFoon. Some of you may know Andrew. He's the CEO of Mixbook, which is like a photo book app or a website. You go in and you upload your photos and you arrange them, and it creates a photo book. And I recorded a podcast with Andrew, and we had a great conversation because he described his technology, which is obviously, I mean, maybe not obviously, but it's not an uncommon technology. There's nothing particularly Christian about a photo book. And yet how he described it was he's enabling people to come together. One of the unique things about their application is that it allows people to collaborate on their photo books. So people come together to create a physical item to capture memories. And his kind of like prototypical memory is like a trip to the Grand Canyon. So he wants to give people the capability communally to create an artifact that memorializes their experiences in the world. And when you explain it that way, you go, oh my gosh, this is like so theological. This is like, he's building relationships. He's reinforcing our relationship with creation. He's helping me as an individual to put a physical object to encapsulate my memories. And so all of these things are deeply Christian, are deeply biblical. And yet it's just a photo book, right? I mean, it's not, you wouldn't think of it as a Christian thing, but I think that's an example where you're really, you're creating something that is theologically consistent with your technology. Another example is actually an old college friend of mine. His name is Paul Lee. He's the founder of a company. Threadloom. Threadloom is his company, I think. And they do kind of knowledge management, particularly with like forums, like web forums, like expert forums, where people will share ideas on certain very, very narrow topics. There'll be a forum on knitting techniques. And part of his startup, part of his goal is to kind of surface knowledge from kind of these very communal centers. And so in contrast to when if I search like, how do I unplug my toilet? I'm going to get ads. I'm going to get what Google thinks I need. There's all these kind of like mediation in terms of the knowledge that I'm presented. Whereas somewhere out there is somebody that just has that knowledge and wants to share it out of the goodness of their heart. And yet the kind of layers that's built into our current internet infrastructure make that person less likely to actually show up in my search results. So he has this kind of mindset of like surfacing expert knowledge for the sake of a community. And so that's another kind of example of here's like helping people to connect with each other to share knowledge that's going to benefit them in their goal to rule over creation. So again, it's a very theological or theologically consistent development of technology. So I think that the question then that I would pose to us, we have already touched on it a little bit, is, I'm a preacher, so I had to find words that alliterate to make this work, or else it wouldn't work. But how does my technology corrupt the over/under, or the under/over with unto? How does it corrupt those relationships? And I think easily we could all think of ways that the technology we use corrupts those. But then conversely, how does my tech cultivate those relationships? How does it deepen those? How does it strengthen those? How does it make those more healthy rather than less healthy? And this is where I'd really love, when I started this effort, the vision I had was kind of like a round table where you need, like, I don't have all the answers. I mean, I used to be in technology, but I feel like working for Oracle 20 years ago may as well mean that I like used an abacus, right? I mean, technology has like moved so far, it's not even relevant hardly. And so I feel like that what we need in this effort is kind of like theologians and biblical scholars and pastors and counselors to come around a table with technologists, because I might have some biblical or theological insights, but it's you guys that have the real life, oh, this is how this connects with what I do, or the types of decisions I make, or like, I don't even know the issues you face in your technology lives. And so I'd love to hear you guys discussing this and coming back and saying, oh yeah, this connects with that, and this helps me in this type of scenario, because those are things that I'm not even aware of. And then just to maybe focus it a little bit more sharply, I've kind of always already said this to some degree, but I think our technology culture is particularly oblivious to the under relationship, particularly, and it particularly obscures that, because it makes us think that we are gods. It can make us, sometimes I say, rather than us being as God to the world, we think that we are God to the world. And our technology tends to just lead us in that way of thinking. So then a particular question is, how could tech reinforce that relationship? And humility of our humanity, the kind of our smallness. And you don't normally think of tech as reinforcing that aspect, because mostly we want technology to make us bigger and stronger and better and faster and more capable. But is there tech that can kind of restore a sense of awe, or restore a sense of amazement with the world rather than mastery of the world? Those kinds of questions.